meet and then we'll see what they're willing to offer on there. So on Friday afternoon, though, we're going to have another meeting with them. Supposedly, we've got something to show us. We're looking at a proposal on reappointment where they were going to, they said they were going to offer us like a promotion ladder of some kind for like well, it benefits all of us. Yeah, it benefits all of us. It's just really mind-numbing. Really mind-numbing. I told the attorney who represents our side, I said, no offense, but I've always hated lawyers, and I hate them even more now. So when I die, the one thing I'm going to ask God is there an attorney here? And if so, can I kick him? I want to kick him. Yeah. Be like Sisyphus. It'll just be me kicking an attorney in the ass.
That's your habit.
Yeah, that'll be my habit. I'll have a steel toe, like a caterpillar boot. Right in his blood. Because it's like that teacher we have that corrects every math. But I've been hearing reports on the paper that they've happened. No, I feel like What do I do? Well, do you have a numerical? Do you have a numerical key? Because when I was working in the writing center years ago, there was a professor of environmental science who had a key for each stage. So he'd write a 1 next to something, and then the 1 would refer to a printed agenda that you get for your paper. Oh God, he had like 150 listed on the agenda.
I know, I've been inside for a while.
She was like, thank you. Winner what? And she was like, oh my God, great. Yeah, like it should be there.
I know, that's all.
Like run away. Like profiteroles glory. Yeah. Go like this. Go thumbs up. Universal sign. Don't be like an umpire.
Nobody would think that.
Get to be 3/4.
Yeah.
If we get the thumbs up,
They don't come back to the end of the day. They call it good.
2/3 sounds like it should be your record. But anyway, I think they three of them. It would be useful to have like really you don't hear it. You just kept driving.
Kind of a version of what I would say.
I want to call it.
I'll probably come in towards the end.
You gotta spend that time fighting things like
I was surprised by the invitation. Everybody else turned it down. Who wants to go out to dinner?
It's not like here when nobody's invited you. It's still hot.
So I looked at it, I was like, wow, they must be I guess so. You were both option Q, isn't it beautiful? So we have to get through A, B, C, and D. I think it was It's one of the new string of restaurants on Wall
I ended up going to New York.
I called like 15 different cab companies before I could get a single one in town.
So why don't we go to the next I would introduce our speaker. So this is the sort of last series in our what seemed like an endless parade of hopefully more coming in and talking about lots of different kinds of topics. So thank you all for being here. I look forward to this. James D. Williams received his BA from San Jose State University, his PhD from the University of Southern California, where he also directed the interdisciplinary writing program before becoming an assistant and an associate professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where he directed both the writing program and the writing center. As one might expect from someone whose career would turn out to be more than usually marked by an interest in finding challenges and solving problems, he then moved to a very different kind of institution, Governor State University here in Illinois, where as university professor of rhetoric he obtained, among other things, so this is my particular session of this search, a seed grant of $75,000. I don't mention it now unless it's over like 40. To establish a writing across the curriculum program, which he then directed until moving to Cal Poly Pomona. At Cal Poly, in addition to serving as professor of English, he directed the faculty development office, doubling both faculty participation and the office's budget. A feat he will not be able to accomplish. Great authority at UIC. Until what we can now see as a kind of characteristic intellectual and administrative restlessness. He moved on to become professor of rhetoric and linguistics, as well as director of the writing program and the writing center at Soka University, an institution of which I will confess I had never heard until impressed by Professor Williams' work. I looked into it a bit and found its undergraduate school was begun in 2001, hence you must have been one of the founding faculty. Hence that you are that. That its focus is on international students, and that it founds itself, quote, on the Buddhist principles of peace, human rights, and the sanctity of life. I'm familiar with those principles in a kind of distant way because my brother has been practicing Buddhist for some 35 years. But a lifetime spent in English departments has removed me a bit from the actual practice. So it's interesting to see, how that works out in practice. A little more remote than it should be, but closer in touch today. If, however, you have the opportunity to read his work, and there's some of you already have, you will see that his commitment to peace does not negate commitment to forthright argument and disagreement. Although he is the author of such distinguished, widely used, and non-political texts as Preparing to Teach Writing, Research, Theory, and Practice, the fourth edition of which is now about to come out. Just came out last month with Routledge. He has also published pieces like Politicizing Literacy and Counterstatement, Autobiography, and Composition Scholarship, both of them in college English, which have challenged widely held views in the field. His topic for today is why do we teach writing? Since it's presumably a condition of his employment here, it would actually not be as straightforward as he shouldn't. I look forward to hearing the question raised. I hope you will join me in welcoming James Lee Wade.
It's a pleasure to be here. As remarking earlier, there are only 3 great cities in the United States, and Chicago is one of them. It's a shame about the weather, though, isn't it? Some of you saw me fooling around with my computer, and you may have wondered, well, is he actually going to be able to use this presentation? And, I was beginning to panic because several years ago I was invited to a conference in D.C. to learn about how to use technology in the classroom, in the workplace, and so forth. And the PhD who was presenting the presentation couldn't get his PowerPoint to work. So he got on his cell phone, he called upstairs, and 2 more PhDs in computer science came down, and the 3 of them fooled around with it for about 15 or 20 minutes. They couldn't get it to work, so they got on the phone again, and 2 more. We had 5 or 6 PhDs in computer science who couldn't get PowerPoint to work, and at that time I said, well, no, let's go out for lunch. So we left. But fortunately, we do have this thing working, and I've got my trusty phone here, and hopefully it's still going to work, because this fancy computer I have does not have an infrared receiver, and so I can't use a remote click. But thank goodness for Apple, because they have a remote that turns my iPhone into a remote device. It's amazing. So in any event, I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about some of the research that I'm engaged in. During one of the initial interviews, I was asked, well, the other people who have come here, they do writing, but they also do other things like Renaissance literature or 18th century British literature, but you're not doing any of that. What's the deal? And so I had to confess that I'm really primarily interested in very few things in life. My family and writing and education being 2 others. And so most of what I do is really about language, about writing, and about teaching. I've spent a lot of time working in the public schools, working with them to improve what they're doing so that the students they send to us are not quite so illiterate. I'm failing, by the way. I don't know if you've noticed, but our students are actually losing their literacy skills. And so today's presentation is really going to talk about some work that I've been doing over the last several months about why we teach writing. And this research involved a national study that I started back in the early fall because I've done a lot of work writing across the curriculum. And one of the things that is the operational rationale of writing across the curriculum is that these composition courses, because they focus on helping students master the conventions, ways of knowing, standards of proof, etc., in specific disciplines, are going to help those students perform better in their content area courses, where they are occasionally asked to write a research paper or one thing or another. And I started doing a literature search, and I found that there simply is very little, if any, research examining that question. Do these writing across the curriculum courses actually help students do better in their content area courses? Now, in the course of that research, I began to see that there are 4 primary rationales for teaching writing. And I base that on the feedback that participants have been providing me over the months. And this study is not complete, but I do have some preliminary data. So at the top of the list is to promote students' critical thinking. And we all want students to think more critically. Number 2 is to engage students in self-reflection and self-assessment. And, well, that seemed like a good idea also. Number 3, which I'm not going to talk a lot about because I just didn't get enough data on this, is to promote student social awareness through resistant writing assignments. This is sort of a kind of cultural studies, radical pedagogical approach to teaching writing. And then at the bottom of the list is to help students succeed academically, which I found really surprising, but when I rank ordered all these things, that came out at the bottom. Okay, so let's take orientation 1, critical thinking. And there are multiple views on critical thinking. But most of them may be surprising to those of you who are not trained in the social sciences. Alpert, for example, argued that critical thinking consists of using, quote, those cognitive skills or strategies that increase the probability of a desirable outcome. I don't even know what that means. But it sounds really great because I wish I could control my environment. There are lots of desirable outcomes I would wish for. Then we have Barnett and Vidal. Critical thinking involves a rational analysis that is transportable to a range of intellectual activities, especially writing. Now that sounds important because we want what we do in a writing course to be transportable. Now we want them to be able to write well in our courses, in their chemistry class, in their history class, and so forth. Then there's more. Paul and Elder. Critical thinking is the well-informed, objective, unbiased, analytical assessment of the subject. I like to think that I do that, but then I've come to realize that when I really am honest, I have a lot of biases that influence my assessments. They pass through what in psychology we call an affective filter. And emotion triumphs. Any Bugs Bunny fans in here? Okay. Bugs Bunny is my hero because he encapsulates human nature so well. He's always being tempted. And reason says, if I do that, I'm going to hate myself in the morning. But then what does he decide to do? I'll do it. So this is the ideal. Kuhn, critical thinking is hard mental work, far beyond the abilities of most people who struggle even with basic reasoning skills. Now that is kind of startling because most people assume that everyone is capable of critical thought, critical thinking. Kuhn says no. Why is that? Well, Walcott et al. In their study in 2002 found in their review of the literature that, quote, although numerous ideas for developing critical thinking skills have been generated, there remains a significant lack of empirical support for any of the proposed efforts. Willingham. Most of the evidence for improvements in critical thinking is anecdotal. Critical thinking is possible only when a person has a deep knowledge of a given subject. And then I think about my freshmen in my freshman composition class. If I asked them who is the President of the United States, many of them would say Abraham Lincoln. If I asked them, what is the nature of a thesis statement, most of them say, I don't know. So then we get to a review of studies aimed at teaching critical thinking, and this review showed that the results were modest and non-transferable, even when efforts went on for up to 3 years. So you spend 3 years with students specifically working on developing their critical thinking skills, no improvement. Cosgrove performed an education index search that produced more than 10,000 articles reporting on efforts to improve critical thinking. Fewer than a dozen were sufficiently well designed to provide meaningful results. And this is the one that I really impressed me when I read Rumer Rox's their study on undergraduates. 2,300 undergraduates, 24 colleges and universities. After 3 semesters of education, there was no measurable increase in critical thinking skills, reasoning skills, or communication skills. And a majority of these students had already passed through composition. Now, one can say, and a lot of people have, these are sociologists, what do they know? Well, that's something to think about. Various well-designed investigations found that critical thinking involves problem solving. And there are some scholars who have argued that our ability to engage in critical thinking is the result of the society we've created, where we no longer have to solve problems. $10,000 years ago, there were plenty of problems to solve, right? Where you get something to eat, how to stay warm, how to stay dry, how to cool off, real life problems. We solved so many of those. Now we deal primarily with social problems. Another study reported that tasks requiring the exercise of judgment were more likely to involve problem solving than understanding the text. A large body of research reports that critical thinking occurs only during problem solving. Well, then what in the world are we doing when we're thinking all the time? Well, according to the research, we're engaged in reminiscing. When we're not engaged in problem solving, the brain kind of switches off. It enters the default mode, which is just recollection. The mental processes associated with reading literacy more closely aligned with recollection, not critical thinking. But what does that mean? Reading involves the conceptual blending of metaphors. You think about what draws us to literature. My favorite writer is Gabriel Garcia Marquez. My favorite novel, 100 Years of Solitude. What makes that writing great? Well, many things, but one that stands out in my mind was his ability to create these marvelous, fresh metaphors. There's that image of these giant boulders in the river, like prehistoric eggs. I mean, that gives me goosebumps just remembering it. Oh, oops, I'm not engaging, I'm recollecting once again. So, if this is the case, our rationale then for teaching writing as a way of teaching critical thinking needs to be questioned, because the evidence doesn't support that rationale. So let's then go on to the second orientation, self-reflection and self-assessment. Expressive discourse has become ubiquitous over the last several decades. Any of you going to be at the workshop tomorrow? Okay. A favorite writing assignment among those who have this orientation, this expressivist orientation, is I want you to write about your most painful moment and tell what you learned from it. It's everywhere. Now, James Kennedy argued that expressive writing is largely phatic. Phatic discourse is discourse, social discourse. It's designed to establish, maintain, and preserve social relations. So, when you see me walking down the hall and you say, "Hi, how are you?" You don't really want to know. That's just a way of telling me that you recognize me as a human being and that I'm worth acknowledging. And I always say, I'm fine. Right? Even though I could be a disaster, I could be a complete wreck. And if you have ever had an experience where someone actually answers your question honestly, I imagine your response was to back off a little bit and say, "Oops, you know, I'm running late for class. I've got to go home." So, but you know, it can be phatic. And the example that Kennedy used in A Theory of Discourse was the Declaration of Independence. And he argued that the Declaration served as phatic discourse insofar as it functioned to help create a kind of, if not national identity, certainly an anti-British identity. And so that's a very significant part of expressive discourse. Today, however, we have something very different. We have what Michel Foucault called a confessional activity. Now, he saw that confessional activity as having sort of insidious policing connotations, and I suspect he was right. He was a smarter man than I am. But what you have is private writing made public in expressive discourse. Private writing made public. Some of the more egregious examples, of course, we see on TV. Jerry Springer, Dr. Phil, what's the other fellow's name? Maury Povich, where people get in front of a television audience and are willing to confess of doing the most horrible things. Why would they do that? Why? But because they want recognition. And it's become a kind of confessional activity. Nevertheless, in the composition class, expressive writing activities are commonly designed to engage students in introspective self-reflection. I know some of you have experimented with portfolio assessment. I trained with an educational testing service for 3 years back a long time ago. And so I know something about the protocol for portfolio assessment, holistic assessment, and so forth. But something happened in 1992 when Kathleen Yancey published a book on portfolio assessment. And she concluded that for portfolio assessment to be successful, it had to include a statement of reflective activity on the part of the students so that they were reflecting on the corpus of work that they were submitting in the portfolio. And this really emphasized the potential benefits of self-reflection, of introspection. And it's embedded in what we can call the existential humanistic notion of self. And is grounded in psychology and psychoanalysis. I reviewed a book by Richard Tingle a few years ago in which, as I was mentioning earlier, he declared that all students are suffering from narcissistic personality disorder. Now, I don't know if you're aware of what narcissistic personality disorder is, but it is it's a serious condition. But ironically, it's a condition that is predominant in males, not females. So you ladies were grouped into a category to which you do not belong. And it's a result of not getting sufficient nurturing from, guess what? All right, so rooted in Freudian psychoanalysis. People told me that I was too harsh on Richard Tingle in my review, but actually the editor of College English took out the really nasty parts. So he escaped. All right, so now the question is this. Is there some value to introspection, to self-reflection? Absolutely. It's used with some frequency in a medical setting and in mental health setting. The research shows that terminal cancer patients, for example, when encouraged to express how they're feeling, how they're dealing with imminent demise, they reach a state of calmness. They're more accepting of the end of life. And it seems to work. And it seems to work fairly well. The same is true in mental health therapies. Some people who are suffering from depression, it's sort of like cognitive behavioral therapy. What you do in the process of writing is you take a different perspective on the problems in life that you're facing. And this different perspective gives you a kind of distancing that enables you to better cope with whatever the event is. Oh, I just lost my connection. Okay. Pardon me, I'll have to do it by hand. Okay. Blakely argued that for post-structuralists, truth and fact and the status of phenomena such as self and identity are relative. The claim that there is a universally recognized and knowable self then becomes problematic. And then I would ask you to reflect on your identity, your notion of self. And I suspect that it's multifaceted. One of the primary sources of our personal identity is our gender, male or female. Then it becomes daughter, son, mother, father, teacher, Boy Scout leader. We tend to have multiple identities. But then we have to question whether there's a universally recognized notion of self. Nevertheless, the dominant practices of self-assessment and composition studies are rooted in this post-enlightenment notion of a model that a person takes to be the subject, to be a sensuous fact. Well, we translate this then to the composition class, and what do we see? Green argued that in the composition class, that this expressive writing results in emotionally healthy outcomes and improved academic performance in those who disclose traumatic events. In the workshop tomorrow, we're actually going to see some examples of this. In prone, like cognitive behavioral therapy, expressive discourse is a means whereby writers become self-conscious, where they come to know the origins and patterns of their own thought. So these are some well-known people in composition who are making these claims about expressive writing. It fosters a writer's aesthetic, cognitive, and moral development. So there's a moral identity as well, and you can become more moral by engaging in expressive writing. I'm not quite sure how that works, but that's the claim. And here's Richard Tingle. Expressivist writing destabilizes students' sense of self, and, quote, the student, like the infant, might acquire the support necessary for the restructuring of self. And he goes on to say that the writing teacher then functions like the nurturing mother that the person with narcissistic personality disorder did not have.
It is a hard job.
This should be self-evident. All right, then I turned, after this sort of parade through literature, and I turned to the research. I turned to neuroscience to find out what is the self? What does neuroscience tell us is the self? What does it tell us about identity? What does it tell us about introspection? Ledoux argued that the self or consciousness is the byproduct of an enhanced neocortex, the result of a temporal component in the neural processing of data. Pico, the self is the result of the brain constructing a sense of time to connect afferent and afferent data streams to project a representation of internal and external reality. So the neuroscience perspective is that the self is simply a byproduct of the brain's ability to process billions of bits of data per second. Kind of frightening. Connell has a simpler response. The self is memory. When you think about your journey through life, you're convinced that the person you are today has some connection with that child long ago. And I often look in the mirror and I wonder where that child went, what happened to him. I'm an old man now. And yet I still identify with that child. I still say, well, that is me. But the only connection that I have with that child is my memory and the few photographs that I have left over from my childhood. In many respects, I'm completely different from that child, correct? Just as you are completely different from that child. You're grown now. You're educated now. You have inquiring minds now that can focus and analyze I like this notion of that self is memory. Well, what are some of the obstacles to introspection? The research begins by pointing out that the mind is embodied. And this goes back to my Bugs Bunny example. The embodied mind is one that operates in conjunction with our physical selves. It is part of our physical selves. So the duality notion, the mind-body duality, doesn't hold in neuroscience. Another obstacle is that the mind is largely unconscious. Most of the time we do things without even thinking about it. And that's an advantage to us. If we can automate our behavior, we don't have to spend as much mental energy figuring out how to get from point A to point B. So much of our mental processes are opaque. We have no access to our cognitive operations. As I'm speaking, I'm formulating sentences, but am I thinking about the grammar? The ideas? Absolutely not. In fact, when I ask students to think about the grammar of sentences, usually their mind goes into a stall. One of my frequent activities, or I wouldn't say it's favorite, but it happens very often, is that students want to know, what is an ungrammatical sentence? And I say, well, produce an ungrammatical sentence for me. And typically they will say something like, well, I ain't got no money. And I said, no, that's not an ungrammatical sentence. An ungrammatical sentence would be, ain't, money, no, I. Now produce something similar to that. And they really have to engage in problem solving, you see, in order to produce a truly ungrammatical sentence. So self-reflection does not lead to self-knowledge or insight into or development of personal or even cultural identity. Because we have so little access to the way the brain operates, and because we are influenced by our environment, by our desires, by our biological functions. Then we get to the research. People's self-assessments of their intelligence correlate from 0.20 to 0.30 with their performance on intelligence tests. Everyone thinks they're smarter than they actually are. Student self-assessments of their academic skill during their first year of college correlate at 0.35 with their grades. That's, if you know statistics, you know that 0.35 is not acceptable. It's just too low. Epley and Dunning are two of the premier researchers in this notion of identity and self-assessment. They reported that complete strangers with scant information about a person can predict that person's skills and abilities as well as the person or him or herself. How's that possible? When viewing a couple, complete strangers are as accurate as the couple in predicting whether the relationship will last. That's scary. So if you're in a new relationship, what you want to do is go out to State Street, call a stranger and say, are we going to survive? Follow at all. People's self-assessments or their ability to detect when others are lying correlate at 0.04. Might as well be 0. So the next time someone's talking to you, telling you something, chances are they're lying. And you will never know. It's scary. This is the one I love the best. So the next time you criticize a colleague for being dumb, think of this. It is a statistical impossibility. Okay. I said I was going to skip orientation 3 because I just don't have enough data on radical pedagogy and resistance pedagogy. So that brings us to orientation 4, helping students succeed academically. And this is what writing across the curriculum or writing in the disciplines was designed to do. It was set up with the idea that if we help students master the conventions, the ways of knowing, the standards of proof that characterize writing in the disciplines, they're going to be more successful in those content area courses. The goal is to help students master these things, and such mastery is deemed to have broad academic benefits because the idea is that these skills are transportable. So if you're in a writing across the curriculum class, you're a student in a WAC class, and you learn how to use MLA formatting, Chicago formatting, APA formatting, scientific notation formatting, and when you're asked to write a paper in your biology class, at least you're going to get the formatting correct. The problem is, and this is based on reviewing several hundred documents from these participating teachers, is that about half of the WAC programs engage students in journalistic writing, not discipline-specific writing. An example of that is when a teacher asks students to write about the effects of global warming. There's no research involved to speak of. It's just something that you see in the newspapers or on the evening news. And the difference is this. And I sometimes explain it in terms that seem fairly simple, but they can become complex very quickly. The difference is that journalistic writing is for outsiders. It provides information that you do not need any kind of special training or expertise to understand. Academic writing, on the other hand, is generally, not always, generally for insiders. Then the question becomes, what are some of the learning outcomes we want for our students? Do we want them to be on the pathway to becoming insiders? Or do we want them to maintain the status of outsiders and write for general audiences? My view is that what we really want to do in the writing course, and one of the reasons we ask students to take writing at virtually every college and university in the nation, is that we want them to become insiders. Most will not, but we want them to. And here's a sample writing assignment from one of these WAC courses that has a journalistic emphasis. On a campus as large as ours, it can be difficult to keep up to date regarding events and activities. Other communities face a similar problem. The New Yorker, for example, helps people in the city keep informed of events and activities through its Talk of the Town section. For this assignment, you will create your own Talk of the Town and will use it to report interesting events and activities available on campus. The paper should be about 2 pages, double-spaced. They had 2 weeks to work on this. So what do you think most of the students did? You have a campus newspaper here? Anyone remember a campus newspaper?
Let me back on that.
What was often included in an edition of a campus newspaper? Oh, okay. So, any critical thinking involved here? Any discipline-specific discourse and conventions involved here? But it's fun, right? It's fun to go to the web page, campus web page, or the student paper and copy what is already freely available to everybody on campus and take some time to look. Now, let's consider some preliminary data of what happens when we look at the effect of legitimate WAC courses, that is, courses that actually strive to teach students the various conventions associated with writing in the disciplines, and those that do not. And as I said at the beginning, this is a preliminary analysis of preliminary data. I don't have it all in. I hope to have it in the last bit of data in sometime in June. And then I'll be processing it and running the statistics in July. Do you see that? Okay, here we have the type of course. It's a WAC course or a traditional course. And traditional course was defined as a course that engages students in a variety of different tasks, such as self-expressive writing or journalistic writing or literary analysis. The WAC course, on the other hand, does not. So, and this is the composition grade, and this is the content area grade. Now, let me explain briefly how I collected the data. I sent out emails to colleagues all across the country saying, I need your help with this study. And this is what I need you to do if you can. If you can't do this, you can't participate in the study. First of all, your writing program needs to include both traditional composition courses and WAC courses. The WAC courses cannot be journalistic. They cannot be self-expressive. They indeed have to be associated with specific disciplines. Number 3, you need to contact the teachers of these specific disciplines, send them the names of the students you have selected as being in the 2 composition courses, and tell them to match these students' names with their own records, have them send them back with the grades that they received in the content area courses. Is that clear, what I'm doing? So, I have then the composition grade the students received, and then I have the grade the students received in the content area course that they were simultaneously taking when they were taking composition. And here we have the mean grades. What you see is that students in the WAC courses received grades that were somewhat lower than students in the traditional courses. And I find that really interesting, and I've yet to interpret the data, but I'm beginning to suspect that the demands of the WAC course may be more significant than the demands in the traditional course. Now we come to the content area grade, and notice that the numbers are reversed. Students who took the WAC course have a higher grade averages based on a 1 to 4 scale than the students in the traditional course, which suggests that the WAC course actually benefited students in the content area course. Now that's not dispositive, but the suggestion is there. So I ran some more statistics on this. This is a parent samples t-test, and it shows pretty much the same thing, that the students in the WAC course did better in the content area course than the students in the traditional course. And then this is a multivariate test analysis of variance. And you look at the F-scores. The F-scores are significant. Grades by content, by composition type. It's an F of 74.6. That's very, very significant statistically. And you see that it's a powerful indicator that the WAC approach answers one way to approach that question: why do we teach writing? If we're teaching writing to help students succeed academically in their other courses, the traditional approach doesn't seem to be doing that. In part because it's based on false premises. The premise that it helps them become critical thinkers, there's no evidence for that. And I've looked at many, many, many studies. There's not a shred of evidence, empirical evidence. There's lots of anecdotal evidence, but no empirical evidence. The premise that it helps students know themselves, self-expressive writing helps students know themselves better. They get in touch with themselves. It shapes their personal, cultural, and social identity. There's no evidence for that. In fact, there's lots of evidence to suggest that that's really not possible. Then the third issue of, do we really want students to use their ability to communicate, to perform better in their other courses. If that is our goal, then what we see is that the traditional approach does not meet the statistical criteria. Now it's possible, because I don't even have half of the data yet. I'm expecting to have about 500 cases when it's all said and done. I have just under 200. It's possible that the other data coming in are going to affect these results, but as someone who does statistics, I can tell you that with an N of 187, the chances of that happening after the other data come in is remote. Thank you. You might want to see the fancy graphic. So here we have the graduate course. Here we have
So I'll just let you, since you're calling people for questions.
let me shut this down first. Questions? Yes.
What should a WAC course deliver then, if it should not approach writing through a journalistic method then?
Well, the journalistic method is fine if you have a journalism school.
Mm-hmm.
But then, if you want to teach journalism, you should be doing it in a journalism school, not in freshman composition. What should the traditional class be doing? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, in a school like UIC, what should a WAC course be delivering then?
Oh, a WAC course should be delivering to students the ability to add to their repertoire of linguistic and rhetorical skills, so that when they walk into a history class, they can write a history paper using the Chicago Style Manual and the type of evidence, the textual evidence that is characteristic of writing in history. When they walk into a psychology class, they can use the APA documentation format, and they can collect observational data, analyze those data, and come to some sort of reasonable conclusion based on the data. When they go to a physics class, if there's a lab associated with it, they can conduct a physics experiment and write up a good, well-written, clear lab report. So it seems very I don't know, utilitarian, but it is. I mean, we use language to get things done in the world. Writing is a social action, and the question is, what kind of action do students need to perform when they're outside the composition class? Now, the typical complaint, because I've had these kinds of conversations before, the typical complaint of people who resist what I'm saying is that composition should not be a service course. It should not be in the service of the university as a whole. Well, I dismiss that. I read a report a few years ago that the private sector spends more than $2 billion a year training new hires how to write. Why? Because recent college graduates can't construct a coherent sentence, much less a coherent paragraph or a coherent report. So one of the things that's been happening over the last dozen years or so is that universities have come under increasing criticism, especially the humanities programs, because increasingly people out there beyond our borders are saying, you folks are irrelevant. What are you doing that is relevant to today's fast-paced, high-tech, digitized world? Well, we're doing a lot of things. notion of the eternal truths of literature. We do a lot of things with regard to helping students appreciate the trials and tribulations as well as the joys of life through literature. But one of the things that we're not doing very well is preparing students to communicate. And the Arun and Roxa study demonstrated that fairly conclusively, that after 3 semesters, students' communication skills were no better than they were when they matriculated. If that's the case, then we need to look to ourselves and reassess what we're doing with regard to language instruction. Now, admittedly, we have a tough road to hoe, as they say in the South, because our students come to us after 13 years of miseducation. All of us, I'm sure, can recount the number of times we've had to correct some of the myths about writing that our students learned in high school. Never end a sentence in a preposition. And how in the world do you ask a question like, won't you come in? Or, what house do you live in? The green one or the red one? Or the number of times students have been told you can never begin a sentence with a subordinating or coordinating conjunction. Now, what this demonstrates to me is that their teachers simply are not good readers. Because anyone who's read a real text written by professionals know that those writers begin sentences with conjunctions on a regular basis, and they end sentences with prepositions. We do that every day in natural language. Another thing that's puzzling to me is that all public school teachers went through college. They all have at least a bachelor's degree. They had to write the same kind of papers that we're asking them to write, our students to write, but they're not asking their students to write those kinds of papers. That's a total mystery to me. And so if we're going to do our jobs effectively, we have to do more than just work in the classroom with our individual students. We have to coordinate with other faculty and other departments, and we have to do a better job of communicating the standards, expectations of the undergraduate curriculum to the public schools. And that's a real challenge.
I'm a little bit confused just hearing you speak now with some complaints about natural language, which I completely understand why you have that frustration. But it starts to seem there as if what you're really committed to is not something that's discipline specific, but something that we could really kind of share across the university, and that would be a kind of defense of some kind of principles, like academic and not so academic ways of writing that